Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. Now, today we are continuing our studies from the book of Proverbs, the collection of wise sayings from Solomon, or by Solomon, the collection by Solomon. And as we have been noting, Proverbs is a wisdom book, a book of wisdom. And, I think there are two kinds of wisdom when we think about God's wisdom. We often think of what is the wise thing to do? It is to follow God's will. And in particular circumstances or settings, knowing what God's will is may be difficult to know. Yes, we can draw upon the wisdom sayings from Proverbs and the rest of the Bible in guiding us in knowing God's will. But sometimes we just have to apply God's standards and the things we have learned from His Word, the Bible, to know as well as we can what God's will is. Sometimes God does not reveal that to us as strongly as He does other times. There is another kind of wisdom, and frankly, the second kind of wisdom is what we have primarily been studying in Proverbs. And that's the wisdom of knowing and choosing ahead of time what paths to take in life's journey. There is the pathway that has been laid out and even illuminated by God's words of how we should live. There are also paths that we should not take, that we should avoid, because they lead to destruction. And it is this type of wisdom, the wisdom of making proper choices, knowing ahead of time the straight path, the path that is illuminated, from knowing the difference from the path that is dangerous or that leads to destruction, even if it seems to be most appealing, most tempting to take. Well, today's lesson is from chapter 5 of the book of Proverbs, and it continues that same theme of recognizing a path that can lead to destruction and staying away from that path and staying on the path that God sets before us. It's been said that you can live and learn, or you can listen and learn. The wisest thing would be to listen and learn, because the more painful route is the one who experiences all of the difficulties, all of the problems themselves, and learns from it. And so if we can learn from either somebody who has traveled that painful path and gives us instructions in how to avoid it and lets us know how it is painful, or by somebody who has also been able to learn, however they have been taught it, from living or from listening or from observing, that would be the path that we should take. That more advisable path is the one that experience, whether lived or learned, gives us. And that's what we've been studying the last few weeks from Proverbs. We have been given the opportunity to listen, that is, to hear what Solomon had to say to his children and to learn from it. Today's verses deal with a subject that we need wisdom on in our culture. In our culture today, each of us, all of us, are bombarded with messages about that involve sexual impurity. I started to say immorality, but let me just say sexual impurity. The immorality is the actual engaging in what is wrong. Sexual temptation is everywhere. But the good news for us is that the Word of God in Proverbs gives us some strategies to defeat this sexual temptation when it comes. Now, I've been told that many of our viewers watching our Sunday school lessons have reached a stage in life maybe similar in age-wise to the stage I've reached and might say those things no longer apply to me. Well, first of all, they can apply if temptation rears its head in your life. But maybe more than anything else, we might be able to be the ones who provide the instruction to our younger, either children or grandchildren. And it might be that they would listen and learn from us. And so it's appropriate for us to delve into this subject also. In today's chapter, Solomon is still the teacher, or the teacher is still the father, and I believe it's Solomon. And he's telling his son and children about this potentially dangerous kind of temptation. If we want to avoid all the difficulties, all the pains that exist with this kind of temptation, and if we want to honor God in this area, we can use strategies that are laid out before us here in chapter 5. The first strategy to help us avoid the pain and destruction of sexual temptation is found in verses 3 through 6. We might call this strategy know the reality. Now, I think that's basically what Solomon has been saying in all of the first 4 chapters. Know the realities. And so with sexual temptations, he's going to list some. I'm reading from the New International Translation if you want to, or New International Version, if you want to read along with me. Verses 3 through 6 read as follows. For the lips of the adulterous woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths wander aimlessly, but she does not know it. Again, this is the father talking to his son. We know that from verse 1, which reads, my son, pay attention to my wisdom. So once again, it's the father talking to the son. He then, from there, goes on to begin delivering the teaching. And so in verse 3, as we just read, he said, for the lips of the adulterous woman. Now, the King James Version says this immoral woman. Actually, that's the New King James Version. The King James Version says this strange woman. So how do we deal with this? First of all, remember, Proverbs is dealing in probabilities. And so the general wisdom about the adulterous woman, and here adulteress means a woman outside of the marriage bonds. But the general wisdom about the immoral or the adulterous woman, the woman outside of your marriage relationship, is that she does not have the same moral virtue as your wife has in her relationship to you. So the father, wanting his son not to get hurt, gives him this advice. So what does he say about this woman? Well, he said, "For the lips of the adulterous woman drip honey." In terms of speech, what she says, she sounds good. The sweetest food that they had in Israel at that time was honey. And so Solomon is painting a vivid word picture. Her lips drip with smooth words like honey, as honey drips from the honeycomb. But that's not all. Her speech is smoother than oil. Now, the common oil in Israel is olive oil, and certainly it was at that time. And it was used in many different ways that were very beneficial. Olive oil also was an indicator of prosperity. Lack of oil was a tragedy, a travesty. So essentially, the father is saying, my son, the sexual, immoral, forbidden woman will sound as good as the best things in life. But in the end, that conjunction, but, is pretty important, for it leads to the wisdom advice in this passage. This immoral woman, this adulterous woman, this woman who is not someone you're married to, she will look good, she will sound good, but her end is destruction. Because in the end, she is bitter as gall. So what is the gall? Well, and let me also point out, some translations say wormwood, the King James. She is bitter as wormwood. Well, this is just a word describing a type of plant that's associated with other plants that are poisonous. In Amos, in the Old Testament, Amos chapter 6, verse 12, this same word is translated as hemlock, a poison. And her speech or her mouth is as sharp as a double-edged sword. Let me change my notes page. So she is described as a two-edged sword. I read that the Hebrew word here would probably be better translated as a sword mouth, or a mouth of razors, a mouth of swords. So Solomon tells his son, she is really not honey and oil. In truth, she is poison and sharp as razors. So Solomon is saying to his son, he's warning him that the reality of pursuing this kind of relationship, this kind of woman, and by the way, Solomon is talking to his son here, but this could just as easily be expressed to the daughter with the roles reversed. A daughter, if you're going to pursue a man outside of the marriage relationship, and that's really what the lesson is here, then you're going to find these same difficulties. The reality of the situation is that this person, this woman to the son, doesn't really match the temptation. It looks like honey and oil, but really it's poison and swords. And where she takes you is not good. She takes you on a path to death and hell. Verse 5, her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. Some translations say Sheol, or the place of the living dead, hell. She gives no thought to the way of her life. Her paths wander aimlessly, verse 6 says, but she does not know it. She doesn't even consider the way of wisdom or the path that takes is set out before her in her life, or the pathway of justice. Her ways are unstable. The way of wisdom is not clear to her in any way. So why would you want to get on that path with her? What do we have here? Once again, we have a father trying to let his son know where the traps are. She looks good, but the end result is death and the grave. If you're going to defeat sexual temptation in our lives, we have to look at the reality of sex outside of marriage. I came across a quote that I really liked from Ben Jennings of Canton Baptist Temple. He said, "Sex is like fire. In the fireplace, it is pleasant, helpful, and even necessary. If it gets out of the fireplace, it can burn your house down." The second strategy to defeat sexual temptation can be found in verses 7 through 11. We might call it the strategy of relying on removal. First strategy, know the reality, know what can happen and what is real. And secondly, rely on removal. Verse 7, "Now then, my sons, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say." So he's setting up the framework of thinking about this kind of extramarital relationship, sexual activity. He set up the foundation for the discussion. So speaking to his son, he pleads for his son, and it says plural, sons, his children, to listen and to obey what he is trying to say in these following verses. He says in verse 8, "Keep to a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house." The key idea here is don't even get close to this person. As an addendum to that, I think it's saying you're not likely to be tempted if you don't place yourself in the place where temptation is occurring. But if you are already close to this person who is not a part of your marriage, get away. Get far, far away. If necessary, run. We don't have to look any further than 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, to get the same message from Paul the apostle. Paul wrote in verse 18, "Flee from sexual immorality." Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against his own body. So, wisdom should suggest to us that we should not mess around with sexual sin. Run away from it. Flee from it. Flee from being near it. Just avoid it totally. If you're going to be in a place where temptation might occur, don't get in that place. Why? Because the end is destruction and death. In essence, maybe the Father is trying to illustrate that there should be some guardrails that keep us from running off the illuminated path and getting on the path to destruction. Use these guardrails, such as stay away from the place of temptation. Decide beforehand to not even go near the temptation that this kind of person represents, because the hazards that lay beyond the guardrails are too great. Now, this reminds me of one of the illustrations I've used a couple of times in our wisdom study here from Proverbs. I think back to when my children were youth, and I think this is wisdom instruction for our youth in particular. Their youth leader at the time here at Colonial Hill was Lynn Pryor, and I have forever been grateful to Lynn for teaching our children this principle. And in particular, my son, he says, you choose ahead of time. You're at the time of life when you're going to be dating. And there are hormones and passions of the young person, really the young adult, the 16, 17, 18-year-olds. Choose ahead of time that you will choose to remain sexually pure for your marriage relationship. Don't wait until you're in the midst of the temptations and passions and hormonal activity to try to decide whether I will or I will not engage in premarital sex. Does the instruction from Solomon mean that we're not even to be nice to or have compassion on others who have fallen to the temptation of sexual activity outside of the marriage? No, not at all. We are still to care for them, to love them, to be compassionate and accepting, but we should not engage in the conduct or be in circumstances where the temptation is to engage in that activity with them. We can exercise wisdom by avoiding tempting scenarios that would cause us to not only be tempted but to succumb to that temptation. We should decide, as Lynn Pryor told the youth of my children's age, decide before the temptation comes that we will just totally avoid certain scenarios. It is wise for us to think about how and where and what, for instance, we watch on TV or at the movies or on social media. We should think about how and where and what we're going to do when we meet with someone, and how we ought to conduct ourselves in relationships with other people. What guardrails do we need in our lives that would help us not succumb to, not even be exposed to these temptations? So the key response to the strange or the adulterous woman is to know the reality about her and then to remove yourself from her. And the strange woman that Solomon is talking about is the immoral adulteress, the woman who is willing to have and trying to have a sexual relationship outside of your marriage. Solomon goes on to explain even more why we should remove ourselves from her. We should run or flee, avoid. He does so by trying to illustrate what the outcome is if you give yourself over to the temptation of the immoral woman. And again, this is Solomon talking to his son, but he could be using the same instructions and ideas if talking to his daughter. and warning her against the immoral man. The immoral is the one who is willing and wanting and trying to have a relationship outside, a sexual relationship, outside of the marriage relationship itself. So the Father continues to talk about the idea, and he gives 4 specific losses that can occur if you succumb to the temptation. He says in verse 9, lest you lose your honor to others, you'll lose your honor. So it's a loss of honor he warns us about. He says the word, I would say the word honor is a word that might also be translated glory or majesty or beauty. And so the idea is for the love of sheer pleasure for a moment, you may be giving the best of yourself to someone that doesn't really care about you. There's also a loss of time, verse 9, also verse 9, and your years to one who is cruel. Lest you give your best to others and your years to one who is cruel. I see this, what he's talking about here, in court. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go on to verse 10. He says, lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich another man's house. The possibility that this kind of behavior, that is engaging in sexual relations outside of your marriage, can cost you a high financial cost. I see this in court all the time. People pay a high price because of sexual infidelity, that is, having sexual relations outside of the marriage. Think of the words child support and alimony and court costs and lawyers' fees, and yes, even doctors' fees. Now, not everyone will always have all of these cost issues, but there is not very many who participate in adultery that plans to have these things happen to them. And yet it does to many. And then finally in verse 11, at the end of your life you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. You're going to lose the joy of your life, or that is a possible outcome when succumbing to the temptation of the relationship outside of marriage. I know this sounds a little bit perhaps over the top. Not everyone who has a little fling has all of these problems. But so many do. None of them think that this will happen to me. Nobody will know is sort of the idea. And yet these thoughts are the thoughts of those who most often have to deal with the consequences that they never thought they would see. The third strategy is to pursue the remedy. First, know the reality. Second, remove yourself from it. And thirdly, pursue the remedy. So what is the remedy? Verses 15 through 18 will prepare us to close. Solomon says, drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares, let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. Other than that last line, it's a little bit difficult to understand at first what Solomon is saying. He's dealing with the danger of sexual immorality. But we need not think that God is against sexual relationships. He has created human beings with a sexual appetite. He just also has created and believed and advises us that that can be pursued inside the marriage relationship between a husband and wife in a lifelong monogamous relationship. That's the good thing that God has for us. Solomon tells his sons to drink waters from out of your own cistern. This is a metaphor, obviously, that is suggesting that we can quench our thirst, our desire, our sexual desires, in our own marriage with our own spouse. He's telling his son to love his wife and satisfy his sexual appetite through the intimate and loving sexual relationship with his wife. The idea of water running in the streets, he's talking about their offspring, their children, that comes from the sexual union. The offspring ought to be the fruit of his own marriage. Once again, it is inside of marriage that God's perfect plan is most fulfilled and most enjoyed. Verse 18 declares it simply: if you want sexual relationships without all of these dangerous and undesired consequences, follow God's plan and design for marriage and the family. Commit yourself as a one-man, one-woman marriage for your lifetime, and then enjoy the family life that comes as the God-blessed life that follows. Well, I've run us out of time, but let me sum real quickly. The strategy to avoid all of these problems is first, know the reality. There is danger outside of the marriage relationship. Rely on removal. Stay away from the possibility of being tempted. And if you're already in that possibility, run from it as quickly as possible. And thirdly, pursue the remedy, which is a God-blessed relationship with the wife of your youth, as Solomon says. An interesting and strong wisdom message from Proverbs. Thank you for being with us and studying with us from God's Word this morning. Thank you, and good morning.